Hello, my name is Animal Skeptic and this is the first episode of a video series called 5 Worst Arguments. As you would see from the name in this series, I will be talking about a variety of viewpoints such as religion, politics or morality, and then dismantle the 5 most illogical arguments from that topic. This episode I will be looking at religion, more precisely the arguments that supposedly prove the existence of God. Now in the 21st century, skepticism and atheism is at the rise. With scientific skepticism becoming more popular, and with many atheists writing books criticizing religion, it's quite obvious that many religious people are trying to defend the faith more than ever, with arguments ranging from science, philosophy, epistemology, and ethics. However, more than not, these arguments are simply bad attempts. They rely on false premises, they rely on fallacies, and they are using empty rhetoric to shift the definition of words in order to make it more convenient for them. Now I have to note that I am not going to refute these arguments in detail, as that would make the video way too long. I am mostly going to gloss at the main problems of these arguments and why I think they belong on the top 5. I'm also not going to put arguments like I witnessed an angel or I had a personal experience, since they are too easy and I want to stick to actual arguments used by apologists. With that said, let's get started. The Kalam cosmological argument is an updated version of the original cosmological argument. The argument was named after the Kalam tradition and was first used by Islamic theologians from the Sunni tradition. After that, the argument was pretty much dead until it was revived by the Christian theologian William Lane Craig. The argument goes as follows. Premise 1. Everything that began to exist had a cause. Premise 2. The universe began to exist. Conclusion. The universe had a cause. Now not only do I think that this argument is bad, but it is actually an argument from naturalism. First of all, the reason this argument is bad is because the definition of began to exist changed meaning in the first 2 premises. In premise 1, when we talk about began to exist, we are actually talking about the rearrangement of matter and energy. Whereas in premise 2, the definition changes to the actual creation of matter, meaning that the 2 premises talk about completely different things and is therefore invalid. Now let's look at my version of the Kalam cosmological argument for naturalism. Premise 1. Everything that began to exist had a natural cause. Premise 2. The universe began to exist. Conclusion. The universe had a natural cause. This argument not only uses the same inductive reasoning as the theistic version, but the 2 premises refer to the same thing, meaning it is more valid than the theistic version. The model ontological argument is an updated argument from the original ontological argument. The original argument was made by a monk named Anselm. The argument, however, was so bad that even his fellow Christians made fun of it. So now we have the updated version by Alvin Plantinga, known as the model ontological argument, which I personally find even worse than the original ontological argument. The argument goes like this. Premise 1. It is possible that God exists. Premise 2. If it is possible that God exists, he exists in some possible worlds. Premise 3. If God exists in some possible worlds, he exists in all possible worlds, based on Axiom S5. Premise 4. If God exists in all worlds, God exists in our world. Conclusion. God exists. This argument is based on model logic, meaning it uses Axiom S5 in order to make the argument work. For those who don't know, Axiom S5 is a model logic based around possibility and necessity. For the sake of time, I am not going to explain Axiom S5, but rather I will put some links in the description that show an explanation. Now the reason I think this is a bad argument is because it does not demonstrate anything, and it is not proof for the existence of God. To make it even more embarrassing, we can use the logic of Axiom S5 to prove everything. Premise 1. It is possible that the magical unicorn of necessity exists. Premise 2. If it is possible that the magical unicorn of necessity exists, he exists in some possible worlds. Premise 3. If the magical unicorn of necessity exists in some worlds, he exists in all possible worlds, Axiom S5, etc. This argument is as equally valid under Axiom S5 and is as equally coherent as the model ontological argument for God. You can use this for leprechauns, flying pigs, and even use it to prove God is impossible. So the argument is simply meaningless, since you can use it for everything. It provides no demonstrable or reasonable evidence for God. This argument is not really an argument to prove the existence of God, but rather why they think it's reasonable to believe in God. Basically, Pascal's wager says that because God might or might not exist, it is more reasonable to believe that God does exist based on this wager. If God exists and you believe in him, you will be rewarded. If God exists and you don't believe in him, you will be punished. If God does not exist and you believe in him, nothing happens. If God does not exist and you do not believe in him, nothing happens either. Because with both scenarios of God not existing, nothing happens, there is no loss in believing in God. However, with both scenarios of God existing, there is a loss in not believing in God. Therefore, believing in God is a safer bet than not believing in him. Now, the reason why this is a bad argument is because it creates a false dichotomy. Pascal's wager assumes that the only two options is believing in my specific God or not believing at all. If a Christian wagers in the Christian God, there is still a chance he goes to Muslim hell. If a Muslim wagers in the Muslim God, there is still a chance he'll be reincarnated. If an atheist does not believe in God, he could still go to heaven thanks to our super benevolent God that accepts good atheists. So the wager is meaningless, as the amount of things to wager on are infinite, and as such our wagers are equal. The argument of design is an argument pretty much based on scientific ignorance. It assumes that the world has to be designed because things look designed. Ray Comfort is a well-known proponent of this argument and uses the argument like this. Premise 1. A painting is very complex and had a designer. Premise 2. Humans look very complex. Conclusion. Humans have a designer. The problem with this argument is that it uses a false analogy and it ignores the natural processes that formed life. We know how star formation works without design. We know how chemicals can form into building blocks for life without design. We know how snow crystals can look so incredibly complex without design. And we know how genetics and evolution works without design. The analogy with the painting to human is flawed because the methods of how these are made are different. A painting cannot reproduce. A painting does not have a genetic code that it can provide to its offspring. A painting is not formed through nuclear fusion or black holes or chemical binding. As such, it is illogical to compare it to other natural phenomena. But to say that things we know came from natural processes must have a designer because it looks complex completely ignores every discovery we have ever made in the natural sciences. This is why this argument is one of the worst arguments for the existence of God, because it ignores scientific evidence. Now, what can possibly be worse than an argument that completely ignores science? An argument that completely ignores the methods of philosophy. The presuppositional argument goes like this. Premise 1. I presuppose that God exists. Conclusion. God exists. It does not take a rocket scientist to see why this argument is the biggest bullcrap ever made. The conclusion is already made in the premise of the argument, therefore this entire argument is completely circular reasoning. So how do these presuppositionalists try to justify this god-awful abomination of an argument? Basically, presuppositionalists claim that only the Christian worldview can account for the laws of logic. According to them, without God, knowledge and logic cannot exist. Therefore, even atheists try to argue against the presuppositional argument, they use the laws of logic and are therefore wrong. Basically, it boils down to God is true because I say so, and because only I can use logic and you cannot, I therefore win by default. This reasoning is simply so goddamn stupid and childish. These people are like that annoying kid at the playground who always claims to have an invisible force field and therefore can never lose a game of cops and robbers. They try to completely change the definition of epistemology in order to give them the edge in the argument by blindly claiming that only they can use logic. Presuppositionalists are without doubt the most close-minded, delusional children that I have ever seen, and even trying to debate them is futile because they have already made up their mind. So those are my top 5 worst arguments for the existence of God. Do you agree or disagree? Make sure to leave a comment on what you think are the worst arguments.